You're wrong about Blade. He didn't get his name because of his sword, he doesn't use katanas, and he's not a vampire. Or at least he didn't, and he wasn't, but he does sometimes, and he might be a vampire now. You see, it was recently brought to my attention by a friend of mine that's a little more casually into comics, that the general public might have a few preconceived notions about Blade that are really off base to what the character is actually about. I even see some of these notions popping up from other comic fans who are just a little unfamiliar with the character, which is fair. Not everyone has to know everything about characters like Blade. Blade has actually been subject to a lot of bleed back, where what people think about the character ends up being true down the line, as writers adapt that into the comic book. And Blade as a character is one of the most retcon characters I can think of. It seems like he's getting a new retcon every few years. And most of them work, so I'm into it, but let's just talk about him. So what are people getting wrong about Blade? Let's just start with the name. People, myself included, used to think Blade got his name from the sword on his back. You rarely see Blade without the sword, so the sword must be where the name comes from, right? No. You see, Blade actually got his name because of his proficiency with any bladed weapon. That sounds like semantics, but it's actually pretty important and informs the rest of Blade's iconic kit of weapons. You see, the early Blade in the 70s, when the character was created, never really carried a sword, and instead with the battle with vampires with only teakwood daggers. Those wooden knives were the only blades Blade ever needed, because he was deadly with almost any cutting edge weapon. His proclivity to always carrying a sword came later, as did a lot of the features Blade is known for, like being a daywalker, but we'll get into that. Let's talk about the swords. Blade started using the teakwood knives from the very beginning, but it was because of a retcon that I believe happened in the 2006 series, where Blade joined up with a group of other vampire hunters in China to take out Dracula, and he asserted himself as the best hunter by taking out some of the other vampire hunters with only knives in his hands. And one of them remarked they've never seen a man do that with a blade, and that's where the name Blade came from. Unfortunately, during this encounter with Dracula, all of his comrades except himself and I think one other person survived, and because this group had such a heavy influence on him, he started using the wooden daggers in their memory, and that's the retcon we got that wrapped around to his early 70s appearance, where he was only using those wooden blades. They're supposed to be reminiscent of stakes, as stakes kill vampires. So you can see how we got there. In more recent years, Blade has always been seen carrying around a sword, though that sword hasn't always been a katana, though we have seen it be a katana with more frequency as the years go on. Story-wise, you can look at the 90s Night Stalker series as to when he first started carrying around swords more regularly, and one of those early swords was a katana. However, after the 90s period into the 2000s, he carried katanas way less frequently and stuck with more broadswords or European-style swords. And as of 2024, he's picked up to dual-wielding katanas. And we can probably look at the inspiration for that as being his time as Ronin, who's a ninja-inspired persona many characters have taken up over the years. So it made sense that he used katanas there. And as we go into his first solo series after all of his team books, it kind of tracks that he'd pick up the two-sword style again. Also, over the years, with the skyrocketing of anime's general popularity, katanas have come to be considered the sword of choice for cool sword-wielding characters, so that has bled into the comics. This change is perfectly fine, because as I mentioned before, Blade's namesake comes from being able to kill with any bladed weapon, so the specific weapon never mattered. He's also moved away from his pretty Eurocentric roots, where he would do a lot of his fighting in the UK and surrounding areas, to being a world traveler, so it makes sense that he would come along to katana at some point and take a liking to it. My only hope is that writers remember that he isn't defined by the sword, and he doesn't come to be defined by having a katana. He's never been a character who's obsessed with Japan, and I don't want them to suddenly start telling Japan-centric stories with him in his comics. I just always found this association with the katana interesting, because Blade's most iconic appearance is from the movies. And that's where a lot of his retcons actually come from. In the movies, Blade has his iconic sword on his back, but that sword is not a katana. And this is why I was surprised when my friend suggested they wanted to see Blade hack people up like he did in the movie with his katana. The sword in the Blade movie is a double-edged straight sword. It's more similar to an epee intended for combat or basket sword without the basket. A katana is specifically a curved sword with one edge that is of Japanese origin. There are curved swords from other countries, and Blade has even used a few of them, but if it's not from Japan, you can be pretty certain it's not a katana. End of the sword lesson here. It also wouldn't make sense for him to carry around a katana, since I believe in the movies his trainer was of European descent, so having that person train him in a katana wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And in the comics, the person who trained Blade is an American man, who also used a straight edge blade. Now I can see why people would think Blade carries around a katana. Anime is more popular now than it ever has been, and Yasuke, the Black Samurai, has been popping up everywhere in media. However, Blade is older than the anime craze. He's from the 70s, when the most popular media was the Chinese kung fu movies, so people weren't really thinking about Japan at that time. Blade often operated in London, and whenever he was in the US, it was New York, so he wouldn't have come across a katana, so it didn't make sense for him to carry one around. Even the Blade anime was careful not to depict his iconic sword from the movies as a katana, and it's clearly a straight-edge weapon if you examine the fight scenes in that show. Blade also give us the origin that he was a Dhampir, a half-blooded vampire, but let's look into how the comics actually depicted that. If you're familiar with the movies, you may think Blade was born a Dhampir, a half-breed daywalker, with a mother who was turned into a vampire. This is also the origin used in the Blade anime, so that if that's your first experience with the character, you could be forgiven for thinking that as well. However, in the comics, Blade was actually born completely human and didn't become a daywalker until almost 20 years later from the character's origin, the same year the Marvel movie was released. Originally, Blade was just a human who was immune to vampire bites, fated to be a foil against Dracula because of this. In order to align more with the movie, he was retconned to become the Daywalker by being turned by Morbius, the living vampire. I say living vampire specifically because that's what Blade was at the time, and that actually informed a lot of his power set. Blade was super fast, super strong, and had limited regeneration, and was immune to all elements that could kill traditional vampires, the same as Morbius, because he wasn't a vampire, not because he's half human. And this tracks because when Blade encountered Morbius in the 70s, he experienced the same things, being unable to damage Morbius with traditional methods. This was retconned again later to fully give Blade his half-vampire origin in the early 2000s, I believe in the 2006 series, but it could have been right before that. And it was firmly established that he had the same origin as the movie, where his mother was turned by a vampire right before giving birth to him, which made him a half-vampire. But we are talking almost a 30-year period where that wasn't the case. And it's just interesting to think this character existed for so long as something completely different than what many casual readers assumed he was. And if you didn't keep up with these retcons, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Blade wasn't even a full vampire. A lot of readers from the 2021 Blade series were very excited to see Blade tap into vampire abilities like shape-shifting into animals and turning into mist, and many people asked why he never did so before, and this is because he literally couldn't. Morbius had never shown feats of transformation of a traditional vampire, so why would Blade? Even when he was retconned to have his Dhampir abilities, he was never outlined to have any abilities outside of what he was shown before. Therefore, in the 2024 series, Dracula claiming he always had those skills and the potential to use vampiric abilities like turning into mist is the definition of a retcon, as nothing in the past had ever suggested that was possible until Dracula claimed it in 2024. It can also be argued, and I do personally make this argument, that Dracula turned him into a vampire when he shared Dracula's blood and that gave him those abilities, not tapping into some unknown strength he always had. But the story is the story, so if you want to take Dracula's word at face value, then there's nothing wrong with that until someone retcons the character again, which does seem likely to happen at this point. And don't get me wrong, retcons aren't bad, and I love the direction Blade is going. I love that he has all the vampiric powers and that he's using them for good. I just want to remind comics readers that it wasn't always this way, and that's why checking out old stories can still be interesting, especially for Marvel, who doesn't reboot the same way DC does. And that brings me to my final point, Blade's age. Blade always looks to be in his physical prime, maybe early 30s to me, and you would be forgiven if you think that's Blade's age in the comics, because it doesn't come up often. But Blade is actually way older than he looks. Blade has never been rebooted, so his age in his first appearance has carried over to the modern day. Blade was in his prime in 1973, so that would put Blade between 65 and 75 years old, depending on his age of his first appearance. And this is why he has met characters like Moon Knight before Mark Spector in the Moon Knight solo series, because he was literally alive before the current Moon Knight was born. And he's met characters like Wolverine before the modern era as well. And his age does pop up from time to time, so just be aware. That's not a young man running around, and when he says he's been through a lot, he literally has. Blade has about 30 extra years of experience on most of the Marvel Universe. In conclusion, Blade is an awesome character with a little more backstory to his current status than most people are aware of if you're a casual comic fan. He's still the same man from the 70s that never needed a specific sword, and he wasn't always the vampiric badass that he is today. Go and read Blade with the knowledge that you're a little smarter than the next guy, and please leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you want more videos like this.